Every Kh-101 cruise missile Russia has fired into a Ukrainian city in the last 2 years shares a birthplace most people watching those strikes on the news have never heard of. A low industrial complex in Voronezh, hundreds of kilometers from anything resembling a front line, quietly manufacturing the transistor assemblies and guidance matrices that let those missiles find their targets at all. Not the missile itself, not the warhead, the nervous system inside it, the part that turns a dumb tube of explosive and fuel into something that can be steered across 1,000 kilometers and still hit what it was aimed at. Destroy a missile in flight, and Russia loses one weapon. Destroy the place that builds the part every future missile depends on, and Russia loses the ability to keep making them at all. The same plant, it turned out, was not just feeding Russia's cruise missile program. Its components sat inside the guidance electronics of the Iskander-K ballistic missile system as well, and inside the targeting channel of the Pantsir air defense platform, the very kind of system Russia relies on to protect facilities exactly like this one. A single strike here did not threaten one weapons program, it threatened 3, all at once, all of them dependent on parts nobody outside this building could easily replace. Ukraine had known about this plant for a long time. Knowing about a target and being able to reach it are two very different problems, and the distance between Voronezh and anything Ukraine could safely launch from had kept this particular facility off the list of things that felt achievable. What changed was not the target. It was the plan built around getting to it, and that plan started not with a missile at all, but with an old bomber flying dangerously low across terrain built to hide it from exactly the kind of radar network Russia had spent years perfecting around cities like this one. The Su-24M assigned to this mission was, on paper, a strange choice for a strike this important. Decades old, designed as a frontline attack aircraft for a completely different era of warfare, it had been modified specifically to carry British-supplied Storm Shadow cruise missiles slung beneath its wings, a pairing nobody who designed either the airframe or the weapon ever anticipated. What made the aircraft usable here was not its own capability. It was the fact that Russian air defense crews along this corridor had watched Su-24 missions before, enough times to think they understood the pattern, the typical approach altitude, the typical release point, the typical egress route a pilot flying this airframe with this weapon tends to favor. Russia had prepared for exactly the mission it expected to see. It had not prepared for the version Ukraine was actually about to fly. Layered across the approach corridor sat a defense network built in real depth. An S-400 battery covered the long range, reaching out with radar built to catch anything flying high enough or loud enough to stand out clearly against open sky. A Buck M3 sat closer in, covering the medium altitudes a bomber typically climbs into during the final run toward a release point. And Pantsir systems held the short-range gap, ready to catch anything that made it past the first 2 layers, and got close enough for a gun and missile system to finish the job. On its own, any one of these systems represents a serious threat to an aircraft as old and as non-stealthy as a Su-24. Layered together, coordinated, and cued specifically to the kind of profile this exact airframe usually flies, they were supposed to make this particular mission close to a guaranteed loss. Ukraine's answer to that was not to somehow make the Su-24 invisible. It was to make sure Russian radar had something else, several something elses, far more interesting to look at first. Ukrainian MiG-29s, operating well clear of the actual strike package, launched a spread of ADM-160 MALD decoys ahead of the main mission. Small, expendable, jet-powered vehicles built for exactly one purpose: looking, on radar, close enough to a real aircraft or cruise missile that a defense network cannot afford to ignore them. A MALD carries no warhead worth mentioning. What it carries is a radar cross-section and flight profile tuned to mimic something that does, along with, in some variants, the ability to broadcast electronic signatures that make it look even more convincingly like the aircraft or missile it is imitating. To an S-400 or Buck M3 crew watching multiple contacts appear on their screens behaving exactly like real threats, there is no safe option that involves waiting to find out which ones are real. Every credible-looking contact has to be treated as one, tracked and engaged. Because the alternative, ignoring a decoy that turns out to be a live cruise missile, is the kind of mistake that gets an entire facility destroyed and an officer's career ended alongside it. This is, in a sense, the oldest problem in air defense wearing a new set of electronics. A network built to stop a small number of genuine, high-value threats has to make a binary decision about every contact it sees, and it has to make that decision fast, with incomplete information, under the assumption that guessing wrong in the wrong direction is unacceptable. Decoys do not need to be perfect replicas to exploit that pressure. They only need to be convincing enough, for long enough, that treating them as real is the only decision a crew can defend afterward if something does go wrong. Russian batteries did exactly what that logic demanded of them. Interceptors went up against multiple MALD tracks across the corridor. Real missiles fired at targets that had nothing worth destroying inside them, each engagement burning through a limited stockpile of interceptors that would matter enormously in a few more minutes. And every one of those engagements did something else, something the decoys were built to exploit just as much as the interceptors they drew fire from. It forced Russian radar to switch from passive scanning to active tracking and fire control mode, briefly but unmistakably revealing exactly where each battery sat and how it was oriented. A radar system that stays silent is hard to find. A radar system locking onto a target and guiding a missile toward it is, for a few critical seconds, broadcasting its own position to anyone listening for it. While that entire layer of the defense network was busy chasing aircraft that were never going to hit anything, the actual Su-24 stayed low, following terrain the same way every other mission in this kind of raid depends on. Invisible not because of any stealth technology built into a decades-old Soviet airframe, but because nothing scanning for it that night had any radar time left over to look for a fourth kind of contact after the first three had already demanded everything the system had. At the moment the mission had been built around, the Su-24 climbed. Not far and not for long, just long enough to clear the terrain masking it had relied on for the entire approach, and get a clean release window for the two Storm Shadow missiles slung beneath its wings. That climb was the single most dangerous few seconds of the entire flight, the exact moment the aircraft briefly became visible to systems that had spent the last several minutes distracted elsewhere. A Pantsir crew closer to the corridor caught the contact and scrambled to bring an interceptor to bear. The pilot released both missiles and immediately rolled back down toward the terrain, diving for the same low corridor that had hidden the approach, and outran the engagement window before the Pantsir's own missile could complete its intercept. It was close. It was not close enough to matter, because by the time that interceptor had a real shot, the Storm Shadows were already gone, flying on their own guidance, and the aircraft that had carried them was already too low and too far away to still be the problem. What happened next belonged entirely to the missiles themselves. A Storm Shadow flying deep into contested airspace does not simply trust GPS to get it to the target, because GPS is exactly the kind of signal Russian electronic warfare along this corridor had spent years learning to jam or spoof. Instead, the missile navigates in its cruise phase largely through terrain-referenced guidance, comparing the ground passing underneath it against a stored digital map of the terrain along its route, correcting its position based on the actual shape of the landscape rather than any signal broadcast from space. Jam the GPS entirely, and the missile barely notices, because it was never depending on that signal to know where it was in the first place. Flying at roughly 35 meters above the ground, both missiles stayed consistently below the radar horizon for most systems along the route, terrain and ground clutter doing for the missiles what it had already done for the aircraft that launched them. This is the altitude at which a cruise missile becomes genuinely difficult for even a sophisticated air defense network to track continuously, not because the missile is invisible, but because the physics of radar line of sight against terrain make consistent tracking at this altitude a persistent, expensive problem, even for systems built specifically to solve it. Pantsir crews closer to the target facility got what detection they could in the missile's final approach and tried to engage. This is precisely the scenario Pantsir is designed for, a short-range, low-altitude threat closing fast, and it represented the last realistic chance Russian defenses had to stop this strike before it landed. It was not enough. Whether from reaction time compressed too far by how late the detection came, or simply the difficulty of tracking something flying this low against this much ground clutter in the final seconds, the intercept attempts failed, and both missiles continued in toward the plant. The broach warheads each missile carried are built specifically for exactly this kind of target. A two-stage design, where an initial charge blows away through the outer structure of a hardened or reinforced building, and a following charge carries deeper inside before detonating, where it can do the most damage to whatever the structure was actually built to protect. Against an ordinary building, that design is arguably more destructive power than the target requires. Against a facility built and hardened specifically to keep producing sensitive electronics regardless of the war going on around it, it is close to the minimum needed to guarantee the production lines inside do not survive. Both warheads penetrated deep into the facility before detonating, and what they found inside was not open floor space, but the actual manufacturing infrastructure this entire mission had been built around, reaching clean rooms, precision assembly lines, the specialized equipment that turns raw silicon into the specific transistor assemblies and guidance matrices Russia's missile programs depend on. This is not equipment that gets repaired with spare parts pulled from a warehouse. Semiconductor fabrication lines represent years of specialized construction, calibration, and expertise, much of it dependent on components and technology Russia's own sanction-strained supply chains struggle to replace quickly, if they can replace it at all. The immediate damage was visible within hours. Plumes of smoke over an industrial site that Russian officials could not fully hide from monitoring channels and open-source analysts already tracking the strike. The deeper damage was not visible at all, sitting instead in every future KH-101, every future Iskander-K, every future Pantsir unit that now depended on a supply chain missing one of its critical nodes. Russia does not lose the ability to build these weapons entirely from a single strike like this one. It loses tempo, forced either to slow production while alternative sources are found and qualified, or to accept degraded components from whatever substitute supplier can be found on short notice. Components that may not meet the same specifications the original plant had spent years refining. Rebuilding a facility like this is not a matter of pouring concrete and installing new machines. Semiconductor manufacturing depends on precision equipment that is itself subject to export controls and sanctions, much of it originally sourced from suppliers that will not simply sell replacement tools to a facility this deeply tied to Russia's missile programs. Where Russia can source substitutes at all, they often come through longer, less reliable supply chains at higher cost, and with no guarantee the resulting components perform to the same standard the original line achieved after years of calibration. Every one of those constraints translates directly into fewer missiles, or worse missiles, reaching the front over the following months, even if no single headline ever announces that connection directly. This was also not the first time a facility like this one had been targeted, and that pattern matters as much as any single strike. Ukraine had hit comparable microelectronics plants elsewhere inside Russia in the months before this mission, each one supplying a different piece of the same broader weapons production chain. Taken individually, any one of these strikes looks like a single damaged factory. Taken together, they describe a deliberate campaign aimed not at any specific missile already built, but at Russia's capacity to keep building more of them at the rate this war has demanded. None of this happened by accident, and none of it happened because any single element of the mission was individually unbeatable. A Su-24 alone does not survive this corridor. Storm Shadow missiles alone, launched from a position Russian radar was actively watching, do not reach this target undamaged. MALD decoys alone accomplish nothing but wasted interceptors if there is no real strike package positioned to exploit the gap they create. What made this mission work was the sequencing, each element existing specifically to buy the next one the seconds or the blind spot it needed, layered together against a defense network that was, individually, more than capable of stopping any one piece of this attack on its own. That is the actual lesson sitting underneath a strike like this one, and it applies well beyond this single facility. Russia's air defense doctrine, like most modern layered systems, is built around the assumption that a defender who can see a threat clearly enough, early enough, can always find a way to stop it. Every additional radar, every additional battery, every additional layer added to a network like this one is built on that same premise. More eyes, more coverage, more redundancy eventually closes every gap an attacker could exploit. This mission never tried to disprove that assumption directly. It simply made sure Russian defenses never got to see the real threat clearly at all, burying it behind decoys, terrain, and a flight profile built specifically to exploit every gap between what those defenses could track and what they actually needed to track in order to stop this exact aircraft carrying this exact weapon toward this exact target. There is a harder problem hiding underneath that lesson for any defender trying to learn from it. Adding more radar, more interceptors, more layers to a network does not automatically solve a deception problem the way it solves a raw detection problem. A denser network gives an attacker more contacts to fake, not fewer, and more crews that have to make fast, high-pressure decisions about which of those contacts deserve a limited supply of interceptors. Every additional layer Russia builds into this kind of defense is also, quietly, another layer that a well-planned decoy campaign can exploit for the same handful of critical seconds a strike package like this one actually needs. Every facility Russia depends on to keep its precision weapons program running now sits behind the same kind of question Voronezh answered the hard way. It does not matter how many layers of air defense protect a target if an attacker can make you spend all of them fighting the wrong battle before the real one ever begins. What do you think? Was this strike more damaging to Russia's missile stockpile today, or to its ability to keep building missiles at all? Let us know in the comments below.